So my name is David Reiss. I'm a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School in Brooklyn, which is in New York City. I'm glad to be here at the St. Petersburg International Law Forum. I'm also the academic program director at the Center for Urban Business Entrepreneurship. And more information about Brooklyn Law School can be found at www.brooklaw.edu. So I was asked to speak today about real estate transactions in the United States, and I'll give you an overview of that subject. In the United States, a common metaphor that we use about property law is that property is actually not just one thing, but actually a bundle of rights. You have the right to use your property. You have the right to sell your property. You have the right to exclude others from your property. You have a whole bunch of rights. And under American law, you can chop up real property in all sorts of ways as well. So you can think of it in terms of space. You could take a big building and you can break it up into smaller components. So you could have different condominium units on different parts of a building. You could have a large commercial building and break it up so that you lease one part to one party and lease another part to another party. You can think of real estate being broken up in terms of time, that a landlord could give a building to a tenant for a certain period of time and then take back possession later on. You could think of breaking up property really from below the ground up to the sky. In the United States, you could sell what are called mineral rights, the rights to exploit oil or gas or coal or other valuable commodities below the surface. You could then have surface rights on top of the mineral rights. The surface rights could perhaps be for someone to build and own a house on the property. And then even above the house, you could sell, in some jurisdictions, like New York, air rights, the right to develop a taller building than you would otherwise be allowed to develop. You can think of property being cut up in all sorts of other ways as well. You can have a timeshare where you have the right to live in an apartment for the first week out of every year, perhaps a holiday destination for you and your family. So under American law, property is very flexible and can be bought and sold and encumbered and mortgaged in all sorts of ways. I'm going to focus on the real estate transaction today. And let me first describe to you the arc of the real estate deal. And it has, let's say, 5 main phases. It has a pre-contract phase. It has a contract signing phase. It has what we call the executory period, kind of a waiting period. Let me talk about some of the main elements of each of the phases, and then I will go into some of the basic fundamental concepts for each phase. So the pre-contract phase is really when a seller says to him or herself, I'm ready to move on. I'm going to sell this piece of property. I'm going to identify a real estate broker who will market this property for me, and I will get the property ready for sale. I will take good pictures of the property. I will fix problems with the property, also that way I can get the highest price upon the sale of the property. The broker will then go out and look for potential buyers. And they will visit the property, they will do their due diligence, they will evaluate whether the property is as advertised, and then they will make offers. If a buyer makes an offer that the seller is willing to accept, then they have a deal. And then they move to the contract signing, where they agree to the terms of the transaction, they sign the contract, and they have a legally binding agreement that buyer will purchase and seller will sell. But under American law, that doesn't mean that the property has been conveyed from seller to buyer yet. Next comes what is called the executory period. And it is during that time that buyers and sellers line up everything that they need to move forward with a transaction. So the buyer will arrange for financing. The buyer will do whatever additional inspections that the buyer wants to do. Seller may need to fix some additional items that were identified during buyer's inspection of the property. And this period in the United States can take a month, 2 months as a general rule, could take 3 months, depending on the jurisdiction and how busy the market for sales is. When buyer and seller have accomplished everything that they need to do during the executory period, they attend a closing. The closing could either be in person or it could be effectively taken care of by a closing professional. But at that point, buyer delivers everything it has to deliver. So that would be, in large part, the money to buy the property. And they have that money either from themselves or, as is typically the case, part of that money is obtained through getting a mortgage, a loan based on the property. Seller will deliver whatever it needs to deliver. Fundamentally, it needs to deliver keys to the property, control of the property. And when everything has been brought to the closing table, the parties will then be able to walk away with a completed transaction. Buyer walks away with the keys and can open the door and now has possession of the property. And seller walks away with the proceeds of the sale and does with them as he or she sees fit. After the closing, if everything goes well, buyer and seller may never need to deal with each other again. But as is sometimes the case, some issues, some problems, some unexpected contingencies may occur. And there we enter the post-closing phase of the deal, where the parties may have an agreement to resolve some problems after the transaction. But both parties are typically very much would like to be done with the transaction and move on, and will try to limit their post-closing obligations as much as they can. So that's an overview of the transaction. I'm now going to go into some of the concepts that I mentioned in a little greater detail. So I mentioned pre-closing that you will often hire a broker to market your property. In the United States, a broker is often the party who has best market information about what the market price is for properties, how to best present the property so that it's most attractive to buyers, and provides all sorts of market intelligence to seller, who is typically not a sophisticated seller, but typically in the residential market has bought or sold a property maybe never, maybe once, maybe twice in a rare situation. And so the broker is really providing that professional guidance to the seller and generally represents the seller in the transaction. Seller needs to enter into a listing agreement with broker, and sellers should read those carefully because they really do bind seller to certain important terms, including the requirement to pay a commission. Commissions in the United States can be very significant. They can be as much as 6% of the purchase price of a property. And often the commission will be due and payable not upon the closing of the transaction, but upon the identification of a ready, willing, and able purchaser. And so sellers should really understand what they're getting into when they sign the listing agreement, and should discuss and perhaps negotiate changes in order to make sure the listing agreement reflects what they understand the transaction is between seller and broker. As I had mentioned earlier, the arc of the deal includes a contract phase, and in the contract phase, a buyer and seller agree to terms of the sale, obligations of buyer and seller both up until the closing and potentially after the closing. In residential contracts, these are generally form contracts that can be modified by the parties in what is called a rider to the contract. These contracts contain very important obligations, and buyer in particular needs to be sure to live up to the obligations that it agrees to undertake in the contract. If they fail to do so, they can be found in breach of the contract and may, for instance, lose their down payment as a penalty for failing to comply with the requirements of the contract. In the United States, the way the actual property is conveyed is not by the contract itself, as I had mentioned earlier, but by what is known as a deed. A deed is a very simple agreement, usually 1 or 2 pages long, and it is a conveyance signed by the seller, conveying the property to the buyer, and containing certain covenants and warranties about the legal title of the property. Typically, this is not something that requires a lot of thought in an American real estate transaction. Typically, buyers also purchase what is called title insurance, which protects them from any kinds of mistakes that may arise from the deed. Not all mistakes, but mistakes that were not otherwise disclosed in the transaction. And this is not really something that buyers or lawyers focus on a lot because there are certain protections in place in the typical transaction. The next important concept relates to mortgages. Few buyers actually purchase their property for cash. And so what we often see is a buyer gets a mortgage loan. And a mortgage loan has 2 components. It is a loan to help purchase the property from a lender. And that loan has a note, which is a promissory note, a promise to repay the loan that the borrower executes in behalf of the lender, and also a mortgage. A mortgage is a security interest that puts the home, the property, up as collateral for the loan. So if borrower does not repay the loan on the terms of the note, then lender can foreclose on the mortgage, take possession of the property, and sell the property to get itself repaid for the mortgage loan proceeds. So this is the typical way in which an American real property transaction gets funded, and if things work out, it's pretty seamless. But if buyer is not in a position to repay the note on its terms, they may face legal process, at which time the lender will try to take the property back to make good on the loan that it had extended to buyer. So in the United States, there are an almost infinite number of lenders in the primary mortgage market for residential real estate. It could be the largest lenders, such as Bank of America, but really it's almost all depository institutions in the United States, commercial banks, savings banks, credit unions. They will all originate mortgages in what we call the primary market. And so there are many, many choices, and it always makes sense to comparison shop when looking for a mortgage in the United States real estate market. I had mentioned earlier that a buyer will often want to make sure that the property is owned by the seller in the way that the seller has represented in the deed. And in the United States, we have a system of public land records which helps to keep track of who has an interest in property. It keeps track of who owns property. It keeps track of who has extended credit, a mortgage on property, but it also keeps track of more esoteric interests in property, such as easements, where someone has a non-possessory interest in land, or covenants, promises relating to land. And this land record goes back in time, often all the way to the founding of the country, and even in some cases to before the founding of the country. In New York City, where I practice and where my law school is, the land records go back to the Dutch control of New York City prior to the British taking control of New York City. So land records can go back quite far, depending on the jurisdiction. Traditionally, land records were contained in books that were called, well, they were called a variety of things, but really books that contained an index of all of the records relating to property transactions in that jurisdiction. So each county, each local government entity would maintain a set of these books, and they were very unwieldy, and there were professionals who developed to analyze these books. In recent years, these have become taken care of in electronic systems, but fundamentally the same system applies, even though it is much more efficient with electronic systems, where each transaction relating to property is recorded and indexed so that people can track who has an interest in the property. Because the system is quite complex, a product has grown up in the United States called title insurance. And title insurance does not insure you against future events, but rather it insures you by saying, this is what we understand the title of the property to look at. Seller owns it, neighbor has an easement in it, you know this, and if this is not okay with you, you can perhaps walk away from the transaction. But if after we close, and it turns out that seller didn't own the property because they fraudulently stole it from their relative, we will actually make you whole financially from this loss, because the seller couldn't sell you the property because seller didn't own it, and we will effectively pay you the price that you paid to make you whole, given that the transaction was a failed transaction to begin with. And typically, in almost all cases, buyers will purchase title insurance, and lenders will also make buyers purchase a title insurance policy to benefit them as well. So after all of these details are taken care of, after lender has done their due diligence and has decided to extend the loan, after the title insurance has done their due diligence, searched the title, found out all of the issues with title, and then said we're willing to extend a title policy, the parties come together either in person or effectively by the mail, and they all fulfill their obligations. Seller provides the deed, borrower provides their money, lender provides its money, title company provides its title insurance policy, and everybody walks away with what they expected to get from the transaction. Title insurer gets its title insurance premium, the broker walks away with their commission, buyer with the property, and seller with the proceeds from the sale. In the United States, there are a variety of housing products in the residential market. What is most typical across the wide swath of the country is a traditional single-family home in the United States. If you think of an American suburb, that gives you a good sense of a typical American piece of real estate, residential real estate. And this is a single-family home. It usually is surrounded by a little bit of land. It is not connected to neighboring homes. And this is a prototypical home of the American dream. But single-family homes can also exist in more crowded places. In a place like Brooklyn, where I live, many homes are attached on both sides to similar homes. Brooklyn is famed for its brownstone communities, which are row houses, all with brownstone faces that look the same but look very solid and historic. They are also single-family homes. But that is not the only type of home ownership that you can have in the United States. Some people buy a home in a home ownership association, which is effectively a group of homes that agree to abide by a set of rules that they all agree to adopt and abide by, and they may change. And in this case, seller or homeowner has much less control over the basics of perhaps the color of their home that they painted, where they may park their cars, what kind of parties they can have. And the notion being, I don't want my neighbors disturbing me, so I agree that I won't disturb my neighbors. And this, while it had began as a very rare and luxurious type of home ownership, has developed in time to be a much more common type of home ownership, because people like the trade-off between giving up some of their ability to do as they choose, knowing that their neighbors have done so as well. In more crowded locations, such as New York City, where I live and work, condominiums have become very popular. And condominiums are very similar to single-family homes, except that they exist as pieces of a larger building. And if you think of your typical high-rise, you can break up a high-rise into many units on each floor, and then the floors are stacked on top of each other. And what you have is effectively a single-family home that is not just connected on two sides like a brownstone, but can be connected in the front and in the back, on the left, on the right, the bottom, and the top. And this is a modern form of home ownership that makes sense in crowded urban centers. A less common type of home ownership in the United States that exists to a very large extent in New York and a few other major urban areas are cooperatives. And cooperatives are a type of home ownership arrangement where a corporation owns a building and then leases individual units in that building to the shareholders of the building. And so it splits up ownership so that the corporation owns the building, but the shareholder then has a lease that is governed by a landlord-tenant relationship with the building. And it feels a lot like a condominium home ownership, but it has some significant legal differences that should be explored if you were to consider living in a cooperative instead of living in a condominium in a place like New York City. The mortgage market in the United States is quite complex. It offers a range of terms that can be very confusing for new home buyers. The typical mortgage in the United States is what is called a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which has a level payment where you pay the same amount every month over 30 years. It has a fixed interest rate so that you are paying the same rate of interest over those 30 years. And over the course of the 30 years, you're not only paying the interest, but you're over time paying down the principal so that at the end of the 30-year period, you have no mortgage left and you own the property free and clear. A similar product would be a 15-year fixed rate mortgage, which is just over a shorter time period and thereby has a more expensive monthly payment. But what is also common in the United States are adjustable rate mortgages, which have a fixed interest rate for a period of, let's say, 5 years. And then each year after that, the interest rate may change based on some kind of index, such as LIBOR, such as the federal funds rate, such as treasuries, one-year treasuries in the United States. And then there would be some spread over that index, and that would set the interest rate for each year after that initial fixed rate period of, let's say, 5 years. Let me just go ahead to some other key terms. In addition to paying the interest, often a lender will charge some fees as well as what are called points, which are percentage points of the loan amount to make the loan. And if a mortgage has points, you always want to compare the total cost of the mortgage, the interest rate plus the points, to see whether you're getting a better deal than perhaps another mortgage which just has interest. And in the United States, there's the annual percentage rate, the APR, which is a regulatory definition, a formula that allows you to compare two different mortgage products. And this is a useful tool to do a comparison between different mortgage products. Some people will get a first mortgage, and then they will, in addition, get a junior second mortgage as well. They do this to comply with certain government regulations relating to first mortgages. Sometimes people do it after they've purchased a property. They take out home equity in a home equity loan. And in the United States, that first mortgage, that purchase money mortgage, will have priority in any kind of dispute about the property over that second mortgage. And that priority between the first mortgage and the second mortgage is governed by the land records that I discussed earlier. And the mortgage that was recorded in those land records first is the mortgage that will take priority in perhaps a foreclosure over the junior second mortgage. So the worst case scenario for the buyer is that for some reason they cannot or will not make their mortgage payments, and the property goes into what is called foreclosure. And what happens in foreclosure is that a court will determine whether buyer is not keeping up with the terms of the note and will allow the lender to foreclose on its security interest in the property. And when it does that, it is taking legal ownership away from owner and conveying that to lender. This is a harsh remedy, but the remedy that exists for failure to make good on the promises contained in the promissory note. So, as I had mentioned earlier, the United States mortgage market has a vast number of players. It is very competitive with all different sorts of products offered by different lenders. It is supported by a government-supported secondary mortgage market that creates a liquid market for mortgages that converts mortgages into mortgage-backed securities that investors from all around the world can invest in. And it remains a very sophisticated, deep market, even though during the financial crisis of 2008, that market seized up to some extent. The United States government stepped in to support the secondary market. It took Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into conservatorship to maintain that mortgage market and to ensure that a vibrant, liquid, deep market for mortgages existed and that mortgage credit would continue to flow in the United States. After the financial crisis in the United States Congress implemented a series of regulations that are predominantly contained in the Dodd-Frank Act. Those regulations both included consumer protection provisions to protect homeowners and borrowers, and it also had safety and soundness protections built in to reduce the risk that the financial system would recreate the financial crisis in the years to come. So ideally in the United States, these regulations are going to protect homeowners and allow people to enter into home ownership with a mortgage that they know that they could pay month in, month out. And we have not yet had another test of our mortgage market system since the financial crisis of 10 years ago, but certainly we hope that Dodd-Frank and its related regulations will protect homeowners going forward. So that's my introduction to the American real estate market, particularly relating to the residential market, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.